Please welcome back today's moderator, Ian Christensen, as he and a panel of experts discuss the evolution of industry best practices for space sustainability. Please use the Q&A tab to ask your questions.
Good morning and welcome to the third day of the AMOS SSA Policy Forum. As I remember to unmute myself. As introduced, I am Ian Christensen, Director of Private Sector Programs for the Secure World Foundation, and I'm glad to be here today to moderate our session on the evolution of industry best practices for space sustainability. As the space domain becomes more complex with a greater diversity of actors and activities, we're shifting from what I would consider a government-driven domain to a domain that is now very much a multi-user domain. And as that shift occurs, the role of industry actors as a key driver of a safe operating environment in space increases. And for those of you that are listening to the opening remarks from Mark Dangberg this morning, we definitely heard that perspective shared in those opening remarks. Across the private sector, there are a number of initiatives to develop industry-led voluntary best practices or guidelines and even standards for the safe and responsible space operations. These initiatives touch on space traffic management, on SSA, on collision and debris mitigation, and on transparency in operations, among several other aspects. As operators develop and implement these guidelines, that practice may inform regulation and industry norms of behavior. Our panel today, each of those panel members are each involved in one or more of these best practice initiatives, and are well placed to introduce those initiatives, describe how they relate to each other, and look to the future directions. So very briefly, our four panelists today are Therese Jones, who is the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association, Dan Oltrogge, who is Director of the Center for Space Standards and Innovation at AGI, Chris Blackerby, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Astroscale, and Danielle Wood, who is an Assistant Professor of Media Arts and Sciences and Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT Media Lab. So as we've done with the previous sessions in the Policy Forum, each of our speakers are going to give a brief opening, and then we'll move into Q&A. So audience, please do submit your questions through the conference platform, and we will hopefully get to as many of them as we can in a good discussion. I'm just going to very briefly go to each of our panel members now for some opening questions, and we'll ask one to each of our four panel members, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Therese, the first question is to you. Members of the Satellite Industry Association have committed to a set of space safety and sustainability principles. Can you describe for us the key aspects of these principles and what has motivated your membership to adopt them?
Yep, thanks so much, Ian, and thanks to the AMOS conference organizers for inviting SIA to participate in this conference. It's actually my first year participating, but although this is an area that we've done a lot of work in recently, so I hope to make it in person in the future. SIA is a trade association with about 50 different member companies, so satellite operators, manufacturers, ground equipment companies, and several launch companies as well. And we're a consensus-based organization. So it was a really big deal for us to come up with a set of high-level principles on space sustainability, which I'll put a link to in the chat later. We wanted to put out these principles for a few reasons. One, we realized that, there's importance in working on space sustainability standards and guidelines, especially because it takes a decent amount of time to produce any sort of new regulation on space sustainability. And we wanted to get out at least very high-level principles before any sort of government regulation happened. But also, we've struggled in working on the international stage, working with countries within the confines of COPUOS and at the UN level. We've gotten a lot of negative pushback on these countries interfacing directly with satellite operators versus working with nation states themselves. And this year, I think we now have more active commercial satellites on orbit for the first time, commercial satellites versus government satellites. So it's increasingly important to encourage commercial actors to participate in space sustainability. As I'm sure Dan will talk about, We're looking in the next decade at having potentially up to 107,000 satellites on orbit. So really want to encourage people across the world to work to come up with high-level guidelines like this and participate at the UN level and in thinking about space sustainability and design. So some of our principles encourage things like participation in COPUOS and encouraging their companies to follow the long-term sustainability guidelines. We work directly with the State Department on implementation across our member companies and hope that others will do so as well. I'm sure Danielle will talk about her space sustainability rating system. We really want to encourage operators to participate in developing rating systems like that reward good space safety practices. And we also want to encourage companies to register their satellites upon launch. Even though that seems very straightforward and is required by the registration convention, it certainly doesn't always happen. It's not only companies, but also some nation states that can be very delayed or negligent in registering their satellites. Another big issue for us is we want to ensure satellites are trackable by active or passive means. I know there's a big controversy with Swarm not having an FCC license because the FCC felt that they weren't trackable. We want to encourage all satellite operators both to ensure that they're licensed, but also to be trackable on orbit. And some of the more basic things are, we're encouraging our operators to work on international standards for data sharing. And they've been very active with the Office of Space Commerce and talking about data exchange needs. And another very basic thing is establishing and maintaining designated points of contact in their operations centers available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days per year. Because a major issue that our operators have run into is they get a conjunction warning, they try to contact another company or even another country to coordinate and deconflict these possible conjunctions. But they've often run into these operations centers only being staffed during normal business hours or people being on holiday, and have had to escalate to very high diplomatic levels to deconflict. So just establishing that level of communication is really important to us. And then really, when you're designing your systems, trying to minimize debris created on launch and for operations, so things like optics covers, adaptive rings that could create debris, trying to minimize that, trying to do testing of your satellite technology to mitigate dead on arrival deployments as much as possible by either doing the testing on the ground or deploying your initial satellites in fast decaying orbits, or investing in active or passive means to remove a spacecraft as well. And then working, within your company, but also collaborating with the government to discuss things like mission-ending failures and try to correct those causes before launching additional satellites. Also concerned about security protocols to prevent unauthorized actors from taking control of spacecraft or ground systems, and trying to at least ensure some minimal level of encryption to prevent any sort of unauthorized access. And just trying to minimize the risk to people and property on the ground by disposing of satellites in accordance to current oral debris mitigation guidelines. So those are very high-level principles. We continue to be involved across the U.S. government with the Office of Space Commerce, State Department, DoD, to discuss all of these issues and really look forward to hopefully working with some of you on these as well. So I will hand it off.
Thanks, Therese. And I think the question of how guidelines such as these groups on this panel are working on interface with the regulatory process is something that we probably will come back to in discussion, right? We definitely do want to follow that thread. So I'm going to now turn to Dan. Dan, you've been coordinating the work of a group of satellite operators and industry actors known as the Space Safety Coalition in the development of a set of best practices for the sustainability of space operations. Similar question to Therese. Can you describe the core goals and principles represented by that effort?
Certainly. Yeah, I do want to send an aloha to all from Colorado. by the way, where I want to point out that last week we had over a foot of snow in some areas. So I'm definitely looking forward to returning to Maui next year. But again, pleased to be here on this virtual session as well. The Space Safety Coalition that we formed, it was actually formed last year at the last AMOS conference. You can find details out about them at spacesafety.org, but it's a coalition of like-minded operators and relevant industry stakeholders. And we actively seek to improve upon the space safety through not only the adoption of existing IDC, UN, ISO, and CCSDS guidelines and standards, but also the development of even more stringent and effective space safety guidelines and best practices. I'm not really aware of any other industry association that's taken this approach of using the existing international standards and guidelines as the foundation for its best practices, and then going on to enhance that with aspirational best practices. But I believe the result is we have probably a more comprehensive and cohesive set of best practices, well suited to help us with LTS. Now, as Therese warned you in her speech, I will mention that we are now firmly into the new space era, and this is changing the fundamental nature, the environment of space, and how we operate in space. I think some people tend to look at our history, 60-year history in space, and say that, well, we've been doing this in a certain way for all these years, so why do we need to change now? Why do we need to emphasize space traffic coordination and management? Why do we need better SSA? Well, it's because the whole environment is changing. The threat profile is changing. We have lots of research papers which codify precisely how much, but as Therese mentioned, we have over 100,000 spacecraft that have been applied for in just the next 10 years. And already we've crossed probably the 3,000 threshold of active spacecraft, which is well above what it was even a couple years ago. So operators who are used to looking at several conjunctions in a week per satellite may now look at substantially more than that and need help in figuring out which ones are real threats and which aren't. Comprehensive space safety, I think a lot of times we get lost in collisions only, but there are more elements to space safety than just physical safety. It also includes communication safety and space weather awareness. Physical safety obviously includes not only on orbit, but also launch, and that pulls in potentially an integrated vision of air traffic and marine traffic and space traffic in the future, including launch. We also need to minimize human casualty risk and ensure the long-term sustainability of the space environment. So in conclusion here, I urge operators to engage in this ongoing dialogue. For the Space Safety Coalition, there's no cost to participate. The Space Safety Coalition and also the Space Data Association, I think, are well aligned to address the 21 new international guidelines for long-term space sustainability. Oftentimes, we tend to focus on only top-down mandatory treaties, laws, and regulations. But I think what this panel is really getting at is there's a lot of good that can come from a bottoms-up development, implementation, and promotion of commercial best practices. So this is where we build groundswell consensus on what matters. We shouldn't be content with adhering to just minimum consensus requirements, especially when we can easily do better. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dan. I mean, I think that could be a point at which good takeaway message from this panel already, right? Is that the bottom up approach has a significant role to play here, and that's what's motivating many of the efforts that we're discussing today. So, Chris, I'm going to turn to you now. Dan just mentioned commercial best practice, and Chris, you are a member of the executive committee for the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Surfacing Operations, or better known as CONFERS, which is a industry group working to develop best practices and guidelines for the emerging satellite servicing industry. What's your perspective on the role of best practices in an emerging area, such as satellite servicing?
Thanks, Ian. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm bringing you my greetings from Tokyo, Japan, here at Astroscale headquarters. And it's great to be here. My first time, like Therese, attending this, and next time I hope it can be in person, live in Maui. So first, a couple quick notes on the background of Astroscale. For those who don't know, we're a venture-backed startup based in Japan, but with an international presence. And our focus is on space sustainability through all orbits through satellite servicing. And we're focused on the technical and the regulatory, the policy, and the business aspects of servicing, because we're going to need all of those, as we've mentioned, to find a solution to this issue. And we're also focused on all orbits. So we're looking at satellite servicing in LEO and GEO, active debris removal of current debris, preparing satellites for end-of-life servicing that are preparing to launch, in situ SSA, and most recently focused on GEO as well, life extension of satellites in GEO. Now, as has been talked about today already by Dan and Therese, and throughout this conference and at multiple conferences, there's no debate. The problem is real. The number of amount of debris currently in orbit is too much. It's risky. It's threatening sustainability. And the number of satellites that will be launched going forward is just going to add to that problem. So that part is done. We all know that. Now the question is how to reduce that risk, and where are we going to find the ways to move the ball forward and get customers, governments incentivized to remove that debris, and creating a market for debris removal, for mitigation of risks on orbit, is not easy. Discussions are happening globally on a policy area, as again, Therese and Dan mentioned. There is a bottom-up movement to have these discussions. And we are working, Astroscale is working with both industry and government to highlight the economic incentives for removing their satellites, removing their debris and removing their satellites at the end of life to reduce that risk. But and also looking at various creative opportunities for funding, prize concepts, public-private partnerships, cooperation with various industries. We're looking at all of these ways to incentivize better mitigation of on-orbit debris. But it's still tough, obviously. So what's going to really bring customers to the table on this, and what that's going to be, one of the best ways to do that is going to be by creating standards. So we can lower costs through a variety of ways, but they're all difficult. We can lower costs through mass production. That's obviously hard, especially for small companies. Through vertical integration, some companies are doing that. Most of us can't. Technical innovation, everyone's trying to find better ways to innovate and create a better process. And then through technical and operational standards. So get companies, like-minded companies and governments on board, as we're all discussing here, to develop standards and best practices. That's the best way to lower costs. It's much cheaper for us as a player in this market to have a standard interface to service a satellite rather than creating ones for multiple different options. We're planning to do that because we do need to remove current threatening debris in orbit, and to do that, we do need various ways to dock or to service satellites. But going forward, having a standard is going to make things so much better, so much easier, and so much cheaper. And that's what's going to drive the market. So as Ian mentioned, I'm on the executive committee of CONFERS. This is the non-binding, consensus-driven technical operational standards for RPO, rendezvous proximity operations and servicing, is what we're trying to develop. And this is going to benefit the entire industry, create a common understanding between all the players in the industry, and develop standards that would be broad enough to allow companies to pursue their own technical solutions, but also to have some way to move forward on developing a standard that can be applied universally. And it started, 4 years ago now. We've got members across the world, and that's something that is extremely important to highlight. Confers has started out as still is funded in part by the U.S. government, but it is member driven, it is commercial company driven, and it is global. As I mentioned, I'm representing a company in Japan. We have members from Europe, we have several from Asia, and it's growing in its global nature, and that's going to be necessary. There was when Confers started, there was a kind of an impression that it was mostly US focused because of the government support, but we need to make sure that this is an international effort. And Confers is one of the only fora out there that is bringing together the commercial operators to develop these standards and move this market forward. So in closing, we need to work together now to create these technical and operational standards for servicing. It's still a bit early in the servicing market. We recognize that. We still need to prove out a lot of these technologies, but the discussion has to start now. That's the only way we're going to lower the costs for servicers and provide an economic incentive for customers, government and commercial, to take action.
Thank you, Chris. I think you outlined our opportunity and challenge well for Confers, but I think one of our advantages in that group is, as an emerging industry, we can wrap operational experience into our best practices and standards and have that iterative process that really pushes things forward. So last, of course, but not least, Danielle, I want to turn to you. Therese already kind of teased the space sustainability rating project, but as we talk about best practice and as we talk about guidelines, it's also important to think about implementation and measurement and how we track performance, right? So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the work MIT is doing with a set of partners to develop that space sustainability rating, its goals and its status. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. And like others on this panel, this is my first year to attend AMOS, which just shows the benefit of the collaboration between Secure World and the AMOS leadership. Thank you for bringing us into this dialogue today. I'm pleased to speak today and give some background information for those who are new to hear about the Space Sustainability Rating. And I'm so proud to be speaking on behalf of an excellent consortium, including team members from MIT, where I work, as well as the European Space Agency, the University of Texas at Austin, particularly Professor Morbaja, as well as the company Price Space and Technology and the World Economic Forum. The Space Sustainability Rating is a voluntary incentive system that's designed to reward and evaluate the progress and actions made by operators and owners of satellite systems to ask how each mission is doing its best to reduce the threat of space debris and space collisions. It's really excellent to be following upon my fellow panelists because some of the ideas that you mentioned will really help me in my sharing. And I'll be speaking more about the technical aspects, particularly of the relationship between the Space Sustainability Rating and space situational awareness data and progress in that technology, actually in an upcoming Q&A session today at AMOS. So please come and join that discussion if you're interested to hear more. The voluntary incentive system of the Space Sustainability Rating basically wants to ask and celebrate when operators take conscious actions to reduce the likelihood that their mission will create and become space debris, and also that they will avoid collisions throughout their operations. And we acknowledge that there are actions that space operators can take at every phase of the mission. During the design phase, you heard about some of the great examples that Therese mentioned during testing, during the mission lifetime, and of course at the end of life. And as Dan noted, these are topics that will continue to evolve. And there's actually a number of topics that you could consider even beyond collision avoidance. For now, we decided to focus in particular on the impact on space debris as well as on collision avoidance in order to really focus on getting those right. And actually there'll be opportunities for the rating system to evolve and include more topics in the future. The concept of the Space Sustainability Rating was first proposed by the Global Future Council on Space Technology, which is organized by the World Economic Forum. And there have been several years of dialogue between 2016 and 2017. And in 2018, there was an opportunity where the World Economic Forum posed an open competition for groups to apply to be a part of the team to design the SSR. I appreciate the leadership by the World Economic Forum and this Global Future Council, which is contained of people who are leaders and thought leaders in the space community. They saw the fact that there would be more and more missions focused on large constellations of satellites and wanted to ask what kind of action could be done on a voluntary activity that would be alongside the regulatory process to help ensure that this new growth of space constellations could be done sustainably. And the idea then is to consider what are some of the actions that can be observed both by the attestation of the operators, but also through external observation that teams really deserve credit for effort they make towards sustainability. The World Economic Forum selected our group, and we've now formed a consortium together and been working very closely together, especially through 2019 and 2020. And we'll be highlighting some of the progress that we're making and decisions that we've made thus far and some of our expected plans. So the team has focused on the technical definition of the space sustainability rating, and we're also preparing the design of the operations for eventually a new organization to come and join as an organization that will be the long-term issuer of the space sustainability rating using the definition we've developed so far. The underlying assumption of the rating itself is that the space environment has something of a carrying capacity, meaning that there's a point at which you can no longer continue to add new satellites and still have safety and confidence that we can do collision avoidance with our current technology. So the idea is that we're drawing from the techniques that the European Space Agency's Debris Office has done in modeling and understanding the environmental capacity of orbits around the Earth at different levels based on the historical behavior of satellite missions. And they were asking what new level of risk of both collisions and space debris are brought by a new mission, considering their behavior before launch, as well as their operational behavior and their end-of-life mission. So the scoring system is based on 6 modules that consider the decisions made by operators for a given mission. So the score is applied to the mission itself. And we consider topics such as what is the footprint of the space traffic footprint of the mission by analyzing this mission index. We heard a lot of examples that actually overlap nicely with the examples that Therese gave, so I love that you made that description. We also are considering the actions and the technical capability of the mission in collision avoidance. We're considering the actions of the operator in sharing data, both about their operational state, as well as about how to reach them. I love that you mentioned the contact information, that's definitely on our list. And we talk about participating voluntarily in organizations like the Space Data Association that are these voluntary data exchange processes that we know create value-added knowledge for those who participate. So we definitely are giving credit for those who are using the kinds of best practices and the kinds of voluntary associations that were mentioned today. We also appreciate and give credit for using internationally known standards and the use of external services. That's one that I think will evolve on the external services side. We're partly asking, could the mission be done and still be sustainable without these services, but also will the use of the service decrease the likelihood that they'll be on orbit longer or have collision avoidance? And then we ask the question, as Therese mentioned, on the importance of trackability, and we divide the concept into 3 areas. First, can the object be detected in space? Second, can be identified? Do we actually know who operates and owns it? And third, can it be tracked? So we're developing mathematical models to be able to estimate the likelihood that these can be done as an observer who's not involved with the mission. In all of these areas, we're going to ask the operator to request a score voluntarily. And of course, they can request the score and keep it private. We'll encourage them to share it publicly, but it's up to their choice. And so operators will fill out a questionnaire and answer what they're doing in a variety of questions in each of these 6 areas. And we'll also ask them to demonstrate how they're verifying the information. And the more verification data they give, the more credit they get for verification, which will also increase their score. It's also important to note that truly one's ultimate space sustainability rating won't be available for a mission until basically the mission's over and disposal is complete. But the idea is we encourage operators to get rated at different phases, before launch, in early operations, and at the end, because that way they can actually show that each phase that they're doing their best to actually do what they have planned to do to increase space sustainability. So eventually we expect to have an organization that will play this role. And I want to announce that there'll be opportunities to learn more about this process in the coming months, and an opportunity to contribute by proposing to be in this role of SSR operator. More information will be shared about that in the coming months. And we're currently engaging with companies that are playing the role of beta testing to help us ensure that our technique for doing the rating is realistic on these kinds of missions. So with that, I'd love to see more discussion, and we are looking forward to seeing an active use of the SSR in the coming years, hopefully in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. So I've been a member of the advisory committee for the SSR, so it's always interesting and reaffirming to see the progress that the team has made. So I thank you that. And so now we are exactly at the midpoint of our panel. So we will switch into audience Q&A. I see a few in the queue already, so please, audience members, upvote those or submit others. I'm going to start with one from my side as the moderator, and that's, we've just heard 4 different presentations of different initiatives going on around industry guidelines, best practice, or measurement of space sustainability, performance, or commitments. Danielle, you kind of touched a little bit on how the rating is looking at how operators might commit to using standards or commit to using best practices as one of the potential metrics. So as we look from the 4 panelists, as we look at these different initiatives that have been presented, how do we ensure that these various initiatives remain complementary, don't contradict each other, or aren't dilutive to each other? So you can open that up to anyone who cares to take that on.
Yeah, I'll start, I guess. Sometimes I get tired of people saying that's a great question at forums like this, but it's a great question. To give you a few examples of the concern, I've attended some space policy meetings where I think the lawyers largely that go to those meetings are unfamiliar with existing international standards. They see the UN COPIA side and IDC and ITU, et cetera, without seeing things like standards development and ISO and CCSDS and other SDOs, as well as the best practices from commercial. I also say that there's kind of a natural split. We've been talking about bottoms up governance here, and there's also top down. And those should be largely complementary in my opinion, but sometimes there can almost be a disdain from one side to the other, which I think is unhealthy. And you could call that competition if you want, but to me this is ridiculous. In a way, if you consider driving an automobile and automobile safety, it's analogous to us saying that all we need to do to have auto safety is to put up some traffic lights and some speed limit signs, and we should be good, without considering the need for student driver training, putting sand on icy roads, conducting eye exams, speed traps, all those other things that are kind of on the operator to conduct and make sure that we operate in a safe way. So I think we need to facilitate and encourage both top-down and bottom-up initiatives and not have competition there. And the last thing I'll say about competition is it's also possible to have what I think of as an unhealthy competition between standards development organizations, or SDOs. In the recently proposed draft the US has for its standards strategy document, we're seeing an even further emphasis on commercially driven standards, which, while good, I think can potentially dilute US participation in international consensus building, national government standards development, and US engagement in bodies and SDOs such as ISO and CCSDS. So we have to blend that and make sure each gets a due attention. Thanks.
So I want to build off of what Dan said. Completely agree that these efforts are complementary. Our members have participated in all of the initiatives that the panelists represent today. Space Safety Coalition confers and have helped with Danielle's space sustainability rating system. And I think it's really important that they do participate in those individually. It's really hard for us to get consensus on space sustainability related issues since we represent such a wide variety of operators. And I know that's part of the reason the Space Safety Coalition exists right now, is getting all of the GEO and NGSO operators to agree on something proved to be an impossible task in that much detail. But having these high-level principles, even if they're not, as specific, has really, I think, been helpful for us in, talking with new operators on an international stage, working with people on long-term sustainability guideline implementations, and just saying that, here all the major GEO and NGSO operators agree to at least these high-level things, and are really trying to work on space sustainability issues, and it sort of helps open the dialogue in collaboration with these other groups.
I could just add briefly that in my point of view, it's what's been great is that so many of the groups are openly sharing their documentation. So we're constantly referencing as we ask within the space sustainability rating. The early phase, we were asking what are the references we should just read to make sure we're not missing anything. So that was really helpful. So both the official standards, but also the guidelines are really important for giving us ideas. And in the next round, we want to make sure that the scope of realistic, rating would actually be relevant to what people are saying in industry. So for us, as long as people are publishing things in an easy to find format, is great opportunity for synergy, because also tools like the rating can evolve, and we're following examples from previous industries, right? So there's other industries that have used sustainability ratings. You can look at the example of LEED for this case. We've actually had a student on our team do an in-depth master's thesis on other examples such as LEED and others in the climate area. So we can look at the examples they've used to update their systems over time. And as the teams, such as the SAA and the SSC, are developing more and more ideas, that can be folded in through our conscious process. So to me, it's actually wonderful that the dialogue continues, and there's actually a great back and forth into these ideas. Thank you.
And I'll just add a quick comment here to close out. Yeah, I agree that the various groups, we need to make sure everybody's talking. And to Therese's point, we also are involved in all of these aspects. I'd bring up one specific one is the European Space Agency doing Paraspora on this idea of developing standards, is working closely with confers on how to share information and develop these together. So that's a specific example of how we're working together internationally on this. I'd also point out that as we get toward more technical demonstrations of a lot of these servicing, we're going to start seeing these things develop. One of the things we hear about often is, well, it's a little bit early to be developing these when nothing's happened. But the adaptability of developing standards going forward, especially as we start demonstrating them, is going to be really essential. And it's starting with MEV has now done something. We're planning our technical demonstration soon, and then other companies are doing the same. So that's going to help to drive it forward.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. I think as I listen to those responses, I mean, I think what I'm thinking about is the layers of these efforts, right? In that we can have things that are at the, either Dan at the international level, something that's top down, and we can work from the bottom up, right? And that's a layered effect. We can have Therese, something that you can get broad consensus on in a membership organization like the SAA that sets high level principles that then more detailed efforts can flesh out on a participatory basis, right? And so I think that builds up a multi-layered level approach to this that is useful, even though it may look from the outside that is somewhat uncoordinated and competing. So I think that's an important message that comes out of those answers. So turning now to the audience questions, there's one that's getting the most votes that I actually want to use as a concluding question. So just for the audience out there, I'm not ignoring that one. We'll get to that one at the end. Got a couple of ones that I think are specific here to individual panelists. So Chris, the first one's going to go to you. So in the last week or so, we saw a study come out that listed the top 50 debris objects that are the most pressing targets for removal. That if we wanted to do the most good, that we ought to look at removing these 50 specific objects. Is that sort of assessment useful to you as a private sector company looking at ADR markets in terms of advocating for capital or government action?
Yes. First, I'd like to make one quick comment. I said Paraspora is ESA, it's EU, obviously. So this is a benefit of having people helping you out real time, like as you're talking, you can get corrected. I'm not on a stage, so I can actually correct my mistakes. Yes, that's great to see that. It's great to see that there's attention just being paid to highlighting these environmentally critical objects that are up there. So it helps to internally to help talk about this among the community, and then going toward investors and saying, look, people are looking at this and it's a problem, and they're identifying where the major issues are, and this is what could happen if there is a collision and if there's an accident. So we need to make sure we reduce that risk now. So more, shining a light is better. Shine a light on all this stuff, open it up, make sure people are aware of where the risks are, get the information out there. We're all for that. And so, I mean, there's, I guess some of the objects that were identified might have a concern with being called out that way, but if we're going to try to create a long-term sustainability in orbit, we can't not do this. So we are highly supportive of this and hope to continue to shine a light on these issues.
Many of those objects, of course, were government objects, right, and historical objects, right? So it's a different part of the problem, right? Future best practice and future guidelines does not really help you deal with what's up there in the past, right?
But we got to deal with both. So we got to prepare the future ones. We got to mitigate the current stuff that's there.
Right. All right, very good. Danielle, I think this next one is for you. You mentioned the carrying capacity aspect of the space sustainability rating. So there's a question here from Mark Vincent, and I'm calling him out specifically so that in case there needs to be an offline follow-up here, you're aware. He's asking, does that carrying capacity analysis include the fact that even 100% reliable spacecraft with perfect communication still do have a certain 10 to 20 or 10 to 40% chance of collision just because of existing uncertainties? So do you account for that in the carrying capacity is the question.
So thank you, Mark. And of course, you're referencing a paper you just published. I don't want to overclaim that I've read that particular paper. I want to give credit to Francesca Letizia and Sten Lemons, who are coming from the European Space Agency's Space Debris Office. And actually, I'd love for you to bring the question to our next session, the technical Q&A, where we'll go into more detail. They're, of course, drawing from years of modeling, and they do stochastic modeling, right? So they're asking some questions that kind of say, given the current historical group of satellites that are in space, what are the possible range of probabilities that we'll see different collisions from the existing flock, and then what's there if you add new satellites as well. So of course, there's our answers are not single deterministic answers. There are ranges of probabilities that will have certain expected types of collisions. And of course, we're asking the question, in that particular orbit with the plans of a new mission, how does that relate to the existing orbits of the already present satellites? I think we could have a better discussion if we also include Francesca and Sten, also from ESA, who could give even more detail. So thank you for the question.
All right, thanks, Danielle. And I think take that for further detail in the technical conversation next is a good plug for the continuing agenda today. So I think that's a good suggestion. All right, Dan, I'm gonna put you on the spot with this next one as the starting point here. But if anyone else wants to speak up, so we have a question. Is there such? So let me contextualize this a little bit. One of the other SSA policy forums we had was a session on cislunar SSA needs, and I believe there are technical tracks on that topic as well. So we're looking at how do we extend some of our research and understandings around the Earth's orbit environment, some of the more future-looking activities. So the question here: is there such thing as a set of stay-out corridors leading from locations beyond the geostationary and geosynchronous region, so that we can have assured access to getting assets into deep space?
Yeah, again, an interesting question. Going back historically, we have periodically considered the need for corridors in different regimes. There's a paper by Nick Johnson from Johnson Space Center in 2010 timeframe looking at MEO and whether we needed to have a protected region there. I think we absolutely do need to look at some of these other regimes and consider whether we need them to have protected status in the same way to ensure that we have deep space access and Lagrange points and lunar orbit, Mars orbit, et cetera. So this is absolutely something we should be looking at. There are some things like for the moon, its gravity field actually makes orbits a little bit more unstable than we're used to here. So those considerations all factor into that discussion.
All right, thank you, Dan. All right, so Danielle, back to you for this one, and I'm gonna kind of paraphrase it here. So within the rating, have you thought about the value of the mission itself?
Thank you, and I was able to read the question. Thank
Yeah.
you to Ryan for sending it. It's a great question. One of the early processes we went through was to have opportunities for input from existing operators, from other stakeholders, and kind of talk about the ideas and the thinking. And start with a very long list of possible features of a mission we would account for. And our goal was to try to be a process that could be transparent and objective so people could understand why rating would be done. So the question was, would you try to rate the purpose of the mission and actually give sort of more credit or less credit depending on what the sort of perceived policy benefits are? We decided not to include that in the space sustainability rating because our goal is ultimately to encourage any satellite operator to do what they can within their existing context, whether they're a CubeSat or whether they're new to space or whether they're a large constellation or a science mission. Each one has quite a different context for why they operate and where they operate, but they can all make some choices during the design and the operations and end of life. So we do not include a portion to say what is the scientific or the societal benefits. Now, in separate work that I do, we are interested in the topic of how space technology supports the sustainable development goals. So it's a totally different topic. I would say there's colleagues such as I know Professor Camille Colombo, who's at Politecnico di Milano. We've talked, for example, about the concept of what if you use tools such as the global consensus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a way to talk about the societal benefits of a mission. Again, not affiliated with the SSR, but it's an activity one could say. You could talk about which of the sustainable development goals are served by a mission, and then have sort of an accounting for the kinds of societal benefits it brings. And some of the other work that my team does at MIT, we're regularly identifying design processes that help teams that are not familiar with space use space technology for the SDGs. So I think that's a topic that could be explored, but I repeat, it's not part of the SSR because our goal there is not to give an opinion on the quality of the mission, but to ask, no matter what your mission is, are you doing what you can to support the long-term sustainability of space? I appreciate you asking.
Thank you for that. And Therese, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one, but again, if anyone wants to jump in after that, how do commercial actors, such as an initiative such as what we're talking about on this panel, how do we envision coordinating these best practices or guidelines with those of the national security space sector? So we just had yesterday a discussion of norms, and that was kind of focused on some of the security and multilateral conversations. So Therese, if you want to start there, and then maybe others can speak up.
Yeah, great question. So a number of our NVSO operators have been doing different simulations with national security space actors, trying to model their operations on orbit and ensure the best sustainability scenario as possible in outer space. We certainly do talk a lot with State Department and DoD about these issues. For instance, at Space Symposium 2 years ago, we briefed Chinese and EU delegates on the best space safety principles that commercial actors were undertaking, and found that to be a very fruitful dialogue. I mean, we work very well with state and DoD. I think a problem that we have on the international stage and working with other national state actors is that they do conflate US government with US commercial interests, and we're not one and the same. So having these, dialogues with commercial actors can also often be more fruitful and open than the direct national dialogues. I will say we also want to encourage the US government to be as transparent as possible, because if the US government isn't, registering their satellites, which has occasionally been rather delayed, it also reflects poorly on industry, and we don't get as much cooperation with other countries as a result. So we do try to coordinate as best as possible with our state and DoD friends, and then reach out to other countries as well to talk about what industry best practices are.
Thanks, Therese. Anybody else? Dan?
Yeah, I'll just throw in too. For decades now, we've had this vision of commercial and government working together while still respecting national space security, which will always be there and be a priority. I have a paper from 2003 which shows a framework where this can happen. And I think now we're getting to the point with the NAPA study and the recognition that space safety doesn't have to be buried in national space security, that it can be out front with an entity like the Office of Space Commerce leading that, where the commercial and government work together, and commercial can have best practices, and those can feed into the best practices of a space traffic coordination and management enterprise. And then that can, in turn, work with other elements of the national security infrastructure to make things happen. So I think we're finally getting to that point, 20 years later, where we can see a good infrastructure there.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Anybody else on that one?
I do just want to jump in. I think it's so great that we can reference the global perspective, because we are Americans on the panel, although we appreciate that Chris is living in a different country. But since we are a heavy American voice today, just to think so much of the dialogue we're talking about must be international to be successful. So for us, with the Space Sustainability Rating Consortium, we come from several countries, but we are heavily US and European. So part of our mission is to do as much outreach as we can. I was really thankful to be hosted in Japan by the government team there that's been coordinating closely to communicate about the SSR to local companies and government members. And just the dialogue is so important, so there's not the possibility for sort of mistaken, cultural differences, but instead we can talk about our common interest, both informal and formal ways. And we strive hopefully to do even more outreach going forward. I have to say that COVID made it more difficult than I'd expected this year to do coordination across different countries. We had trips planned to places like China and India this year that were canceled. But we do think it's important to continue this dialogue because, of course, we have a common opportunity to benefit from long-term sustainability of space, but it can be easy sometimes to get into our national ruts. So just thankful for that opportunity. Yeah.
As the one international representative on this panel, I just want to echo that. And we have very close coordination with the Japanese government, obviously, and we have offices in the UK, in the US, and Israel. And so we're coordinating. We're an example of a commercial company that is coordinating all the time with governments, both security and the civil side. So that's a really important aspect to highlight, Danielle. So I would just say here.
And thank you, Chris. I was actually just going to ask you, and you've kind of already answered it, but we've already mentioned the U.S. government is very forward talking, at least, about leveraging commercial best practice and standards in terms of its regulatory process. And so we see an openness to the U.S. government to these sorts of initiatives. I was curious, from your perspective, with the UK, Singapore, Japan, and elsewhere, whether that's any different in other jurisdictions around this topic.
No, I don't think so, Ian. I mean, we see, let's say, speaking from the Japan perspective first, there's such a strong interest to work together with the commercial sector on this to develop a solution. And there's interest among the governments to use Confers as an example. We've had Japanese government representatives come to Confers, speak at Confers, same in the UK. The coordination among governments globally that we've seen from all our offices has been significant. They recognize that developing these standards, creating a solution that gets us toward a more sustainable orbit is going to necessarily involve commercial actors. So we see a very strong motivation from the governments and interest in working together to develop this going forward across all of our 5 offices globally.
All right, thanks, Chris. So we've got about 7 minutes left. I'm going to return now to the top voted audience question, because I think this is a really interesting question, and I want to give folks, people on the panel here, I want to give our panelists time to actually kind of give a complete answer to this one. We're talking about best practices for space sustainability. That's the theme of the panel, and it's what we've been working through here. The question that we have is, how would each of you define sustainability in the space context? So, big, tough question. I think I was asked it in my job interview at Secure World Foundation, but as moderator, I don't have to answer today. So I got to turn it over to you guys.
I'll take the first stab at it. Space sustainability in terms of the UN and the international dialogues, if you look at the technical analyses behind that, These are done in bodies such as the IADC, where they do simulations of 200-year evolution of space debris to see, does our population grow? Does it shrink? You know, what measures can we take to make that aspect, long-term aspect, sustainable? Meaning that we're not continuing to get debris pieces and tracking more and more objects and impacting adversely operations. Point I want to make really is that that's one definition that's already in play in the international community. But if you talk to operators and their mission to deliver services to their customers, to make their investors happy, to have return on investment, to have a flight dynamics staff that figures out how many conjunctions they have and which to avoid. That definition of sustainability for those operators is different than a 200-year look. They're looking at, can we find the conjunctions that are of most serious risk and make sure we avoid those. And so, you know, questions like the 25-year orbit lifetime, which lets you have lots of objects that are below 25 years but above 5, that would impact the operator's use of space in a sustainable way, don't necessarily show up in the 200-year runs that are often used to define space sustainability.
All right, thanks, Dan. So pointing to the international consensus that we have on this definition, some of the technical sources behind it. Therese.
I will quickly say that we have not come up with an SIA-wide definition on space sustainability, and I'm not sure that we could, given the different interests of our member companies, but certainly ensuring accessibility to space for future space missions is a recurring theme, and one reason our members are so interested in space sustainability is they realize it could potentially kill all of their future business cases if they're not thinking about this right now. But I do want to add that, I mean, we're certainly concerned with different perceptions on what space sustainability is, and there's an AIAA working group that is covering definitions related to space sustainability and compiling, you know, all the places where space sustainability is defined in different best practices and guidelines worldwide. And that's the main reason for this effort is I don't know that there is one accepted definition on things like space sustainability, and it's really important to take into account different views.
Chris or Danielle, any thoughts?
I'll go. So Earth orbits are a natural resource. And just like we talk about sustainability of natural resources on the ground, of oceans and rivers and air, we need to talk about sustainability of our Earth orbits. They're a natural resource. And what is sustainability? It's the ability to develop this resource or region and receive benefits from it while not hindering utilization by current and future generations. So that's what we would see as being sustainable. And it's kind of a broad definition. It doesn't touch on some of the specific concerns and sensitivities that Dan and Therese mentioned. But that's what when we get down to the bottom of it, that's what we're all trying to do. And we've had actually some come to us and said, you know, Astroscale, you're just trying to, you don't want to see development. You just want to see all this, you know, bring all the debris down and just clean up space, but not see development of space. And that's not true. Sustainability is developing and utilizing a resource, which we need to do. We all know we need to do that from satellites without hindering how we or our children are going to use it. And we're also, there's a concept that's coming up and being discussed in the UK on, and we're talking about it as well on net zero space. So achieving a balance between what is being produced and what is being taken out. So let's try to push forward that kind of concept of net zero space, reduce that trash, reduce what we're putting up there, and bring down what we don't need. That will keep sustainability going.
Thanks, Chris. And Danielle, you got about 30 seconds here before we're going to get the hook. So
Thanks so much. I just want to briefly add to the concepts. All the important concepts that Dan mentioned about space safety are there, understanding how we're sustainable also due to natural risks. But the key thing I want to add, I spoke yesterday at AIAA also on this concept of sustainability on Earth and in space. And it includes social, economic, as well as environmental aspects. The question I would add is, are we ensuring that people from all different backgrounds are also participating in space, both now and in the future? And will be sustainable by ensuring that our colleagues from every country have the benefits of space. Even when we start living in places like the moon and Mars, we'll still need to continue to be sustainable. We don't want to create the challenges on Mars we've created in Earth orbit. So let's be sustainable in every place that humans have economic activity in space.
all right. Well, thank you, Danielle. I think that's a fantastic inspirational point to wrap up on. Want to thank all of the panelists as my first AMOS experience as well. Hope to see you all in person in Maui next year. So thank you to the panelists, virtual round of applause, and thank you to the audience, and thank you to AMOS for hosting us.
Mahalo and a hui ho. Until we meet again. We thank you for sharing your time with us. We hope to welcome you to Maui for the 22nd AMOS Conference, September 14th through the 17th. Aloha.